Hello, I'm Jim McLean, a reporter, editor for the Kansas News Service, which is a collaboration of public radio stations across the state. We're doing this interview today with former Senator Robert G. Frey. At the time he served in the Senate, he was living in liberal Kansas and represented Southwest Kansas in the Senate. This interview is funded in part by Humanities Kansas, and it will be transcribed and placed in the Kansas Historical Society for viewing by the public. Bob, can I call you Bob?
Yes.
Great. Served 10 years in the Kansas House and then 4 in the Kansas Senate, and then after he left the Senate, you were appointed by former Governor Bill Graves to serve on the State Board of Tax Appeals. While you were in the House, we should also mention, you were, for a time, the majority leader in the Kansas House.
That's right.
So, how's it feel to be back here in the Senate chamber after so long?
Well, it feels good to be back. It's always been so awesome, to be here because of the architecture and the way it looks. So it really feels good to be in here.
Yeah, and I think that the renovation of the Capitol took place after you left the legislature.
Yes, this most recent renovation, we were just admiring it. My wife and I looking into the Capitol dome and so on. Mm-hmm. It was renovated while I was in the legislature also.
Was it?
But a lot of painting had been going on and that sort of thing. But yeah, this is remarkable how nice it looks now.
It's nice to have you back. So just a couple of preliminary questions so we can kind of get to know you. Are you a native Kansan?
No, I was born in Wisconsin.
And what brought you here?
The Air Force.
Okay.
I was stationed in Morocco towards the end of my enlistment, and I was sent to Wichita, and I didn't know what Wichita was like. I didn't know much about Wichita, so I had to kind of feel my way around once I got here, and I was discharged here.
Okay, in Kansas.
Yeah.
So roughly speaking, when would that have been?
1958.
1958.
Oh, 1962.
So 1962, you're discharged from the Air Force, you find yourself in Kansas.
Right.
And what, you just decided to stay?
Yeah, I said it's too cold to go back up to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And so I started going to the university at Wichita State. It was just called Wichita University then. It became Wichita State a little later, and graduated there. And then I decided I'm going to be a lawyer, so I went up to Washburn University and got admitted, and spent 3 years there at Washburn, and got my law degree.
And so then you had a lot, we should mention that a lot of prominent people in Kansas public life, members of the legislature, got their law degree at Washburn, Bob Dole included.
Yeah.
What then took you to liberal? You just decided you needed someplace to practice? Or?
Well, there's an older gentleman, I think he might have been 80 years old, had come up to Topeka to try and get somebody to go out to liberal. They needed a county attorney. And that's an elective office.
Right.
But you had to be a lawyer, I guess. And they just couldn't get anybody to run. And so one of my classmates, Tom Smith, and I decided, let's go out to Western Kansas and start law practice out there. I was appointed as the county attorney. He was appointed as the assistant county attorney, and that was a part-time appointment. And then we started our law practice, so that's why I went there.
And so the county attorney, that would have been Seward County, and the county attorney then is the person that prosecutes criminal cases in that county.
That's correct.
Okay. So that got you involved to some degree in public life. You were a public figure as the county attorney.
That's right. It was an elective office.
So what then made you decide to step up and run for the legislature?
Well, I don't know exactly what made it, but the legislator who was here decided to not run, so it was an open seat.
Okay.
And I had friends, and I was kind of inclined to want to go to run. So it wasn't hard for me to find supporters to run.
You hadn't been really politically active until then, right? In party politics or anything, or?
Well, not. I wouldn't be known as a real active politician before then. No, I was always a member of the Republican Party, and so, which would be pretty common at that time.
Right, which was very much advantageous in Kansas politics at the time.
Yeah,
Still
that's
is.
right.
Right.
But yeah, I had people who said, why don't don't you run for the legislature? But there were at least there was one other person who was interested in running for the legislature, so it wasn't an uncontested race. But fortunately, I won the election.
So you had to win a primary, and then were you opposed in the general election that first time, or?
Yes.
You were? Mm-hmm.
I believe I was.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we should mention, we're taking you pretty far back here.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And we should mention that,
I'm 80 years old.
You're 80
now.
years old, and your memory isn't what it used to be, right?
Yeah, I think you could say that, yeah.
Like a lot of people who are 80 years old.
Yeah. So, but when it came time to run for the House of Representatives, I did have a primary election that I won, fortunately, and then the general election was a contested election also, and well, I was fortunate I won that as well.
Yeah, there were some Democrats in the legislature from Southwest Kansas in those days, and this would have been 1975 was your first year in legislature, so this would have been the 1974 election
Right.
when you first ran.
Right.
But there wasn't a particular issue that prompted you into politics?
No, I can't say that there was.
Okay. So you served in the House for 10 years, and
Yes.
you were involved in leadership for many of those years, as we mentioned before, as majority leader, but also you were the chair of the Judiciary Committee for many of those years.
Yes, I was.
Right. And there seemed to be an awful lot going on from the time you got here right on through when you left the legislature and went on the State Board of Tax Appeals. Those were very momentous years, really, in terms of the legislature.
Well, they were, yeah, and a lot going on, a lot of different opinions about what was going on, and fortunately, the Judiciary Committee was a committee that got a lot of business. You know, we had a lot to do, and it was interesting.
Yeah,
Always interesting.
It's interesting because a lot of committees, the Federal and State Affairs Committee and others deal with some of these big issues.
Yes.
But what comes to the Judiciary Committee often, laws that need technical correction, or this law was passed 5 or 6 years ago and there's some unintended consequence and you need to go back and fix it. So there's a lot of very specific kind of detailed work that went on in that committee.
Yes, I would say that. That's correct, yes.
And when you first got here, one of the controversial issues, there had been a constitutional amendment passed prior to your getting here to unify the court system in the state. But it was up to you guys, starting in 1975, to implement that legislation.
Yes.
Was that controversial at all?
Well, looking back, I can't remember, I don't remember constituents knocking on my door and saying, don't do this or don't do that.
Right.
It was not controversial in that respect.
Right, because the voters had passed the amendment.
Yeah.
But as I understand it, one of your colleagues, who at one time was the longest serving member of the legislature, Dave Heineman from Garden City, remembers that there was some controversy that rural legislators in particular were afraid that they were going to lose their county judge under unification. And according to Dave, you sponsored legislation to make sure that didn't happen.
Yeah, the county judge, being a lawyer in a rural county, the county judge is pretty important. You wanted somebody there who, would be a good judge. And so, yeah, we didn't want to lose our county judges.
Yeah, as a county attorney, you need somebody you can wake up at all hours of the night if you need a search warrant or something like that, just to keep the wheels of justice moving, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that, you kind of jumped right into that when you got to the legislature. What was the atmosphere, if you can remember? This place has, there are cycles to any place into politics, but this place has become more partisan since I think your days in the legislature. How would you describe the collegiality of the legislature when you served here, the ability of people to work across the aisle?
Well, I was both in the House and in the Senate, so I can kind of contrast those two.
Okay.
In the House, there was more consciousness of the partisan issues, I believe, than in the Senate.
Why do you think that is?
Well,
Because they're up for election every 2 years and...
yeah, and we're divided as we sit in the chamber, you know, the Democrats are on one side, the Republicans on the other.
Right.
And that sort of thing, you know, that you divided up right away. You had your own caucus, Democrat and Republican, and there were no other parties. There was no third party. If you weren't one or the other, you would just pick one and stay with them, I believe. But there weren't very many people who came that were not either Republican or Democrat.
And roughly speaking, during your time here, there was always this kind of urban-rural divide in the legislature.
Oh,
right?
yes.
And was that pronounced when you were here?
Yes, and you had to be conscious of that, yeah.
And you were a rural legislator,
I was.
but I remember covering you in those days, and you didn't always act to type. You didn't always act like, I mean, a rural lawmaker. I mean, you would break ranks occasionally.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know exactly how I would define what I was thinking, but I would say that the rural legislators, for the most part, not everyone, were a little more conservative.
Right.
And I never considered myself to be that conservative. I felt I was always more of a moderate.
Yeah.
And
And
so
those
I could
terms
see,
got coined later on in the Republican Party as it became 2, maybe 3 separate parties, really.
yeah,
Yeah. And so you would classify yourself as a moderate Republican.
I would.
Did that ever cause you any problems with voters? That
Oh, I'm
moderation?
sure that I probably would have lost 1 or 2, or I don't know, not a lot. But the whole general population, it's hard to say what the general population is. I'm sure there were very liberal people in liberal Kansas,
Yeah.
as well as very conservative. But it didn't ever, if they didn't like what I was doing, they wouldn't vote for me. You know, that's the way I looked at it.
And you won, after that first time, you won in your elections fairly comfortable from then on, comfortably?
Well, yes, until I was in seeking re-election in the Senate, and I lost that election. And I never spent a lot of time wondering why. But I think a lot of it had to do with the conservative view as opposed to a less conservative view. And I was the less conservative.
And that would have been in the mid-'80s, when things were really starting to change in Kansas politics.
Yeah.
There had been the anti-abortion demonstrations in Wichita, which gave rise to really embolden the conservatives. Many people entered politics who hadn't been politically active in the past, particularly in Sedgwick County.
Yeah.
And that spread across the state and eventually affected the membership of the legislature pretty dramatically. And so maybe you were an early victim of that change.
Yeah, it's very possible. I got to know it was a woman, she won the election. She came to the state legislature, and I had been around in Topeka after that. I did some lobbying after that for the Trial Lawyers Association. And I talked with her about that. And I could see where she was really surprised when she came up here, exactly what she saw. And it wasn't at all, I think, like she thought it was going to be. I think she became kind of disenchanted with it after a while.
Really? I mean,
Yeah.
surprised how? She thought that there would be people of like mind, or she was surprised that people up here were broader than she anticipated? Or?
Well, it's hard for me to speak for her in that respect, but I know that she saw a lot of different views that maybe she wouldn't have seen every day out on the farm in western Kansas.
So how was that defeat at the polls after such a long run? Did that surprise you, or could you see it coming?
Well, at that point, I think it did surprise me a little bit, yeah. But it kind of, in a way, it confirmed my feelings.
Right.
That maybe she was not seeing it right.
I see. Okay. I remember in one particular instance, see if I can get you to remember this, because I think it pertains to what we were just talking about. You were still in the House, as I recall, and we're dealing with political extremist groups now, contemporaneously. In those days, though, they were almost defined as quote-unquote fringe groups. And as I recall, there was an organization called the Posse Comitatus that was starting to make some noise. And there were actually people in southwest Kansas who were conducting paramilitary training operations, thinking that at some point they would have to take on their own government to protect their liberties. And you introduced a bill, as I recall, that would have banned paramilitary training. Do you recall that at all?
Well, yes, I do remember that occasion, but I don't remember, line by line.
Of course not. Right.
The Posse Comitatus out there was the subject of a lot of conversation when you go for coffee in the morning, and you sit down with the group of people drinking coffee. There were people who would bring it up and you'd discuss it.
So what was driving that then? I mean, this seems to be, again, some of these changes were taking place roughly around the same time.
What was driving it? I'm not sure.
Yeah. People were suspicious of the government.
Very much so. And it's what was, well, I was a lawyer practicing law, and the judges were under a lot of pressure, and I'm, inclined to believe that the judges probably were unfairly attacked by Posse Comitatus a lot. And so I had chosen sides, I guess, and I was not a friend of the Posse Comitatus.
More established, but I can't remember their manifesto chapter and verse, but I do recall they believed at the time that the only duly elected constitutional officer of the government was the local sheriff.
Yeah.
They thought everybody else who had been elected legislatively or otherwise was essentially invalid. And so, and again, I don't think it was a terribly widespread movement, but I do remember, because during the hearing on your bill, I remember being in the elevator here in the State House when somebody who I think had been standing in the back of the committee room rather menacingly, or maybe even had issued threats beforehand, was arrested in the elevator, and I had my tape recorder rolling. And so there was some tension around all that.
Yeah, there was a lot of tension, that's right.
Right.
I didn't feel, I didn't feel like I was in any harm's way.
Right. So when you go back for legislative coffees, you didn't have you didn't have people in your meetings who were confronting you about that?
Not that I recall. There may have been people who were inclined to agree with that, but I never had an extremely unpleasant situation at meetings when we would get together on a public meeting.
Now, during your time in the legislature, notwithstanding your responsibilities with the Judiciary Committee, so many other things happened. I mean, constitutional amendments to permit liquor by the drink, and the state lottery, and the severance tax was passed, and the battles over school funding started in earnest and proceeded for another 20, 25, 30 years. What do you recall about some of those really, really big issues in terms of the way people at home were reacting? For instance, I mean, the liquor by the drink thing was a big change in this state. It
was a big change, and it's politically, it would be politically a very hot item.
Yeah, that was in the mid-'80s when many of those things were happening.
Yeah.
And then the state lottery came into being, and we reappraised property all over the state, which led to a great tumult. Many people think that was responsible for former Governor Mike Hayden's defeat after one term because of that. So you were here at a pretty active time.
Well, yeah, it was. Those kinds of things were taken on, and there was a procedure to follow, whether it was legislative or judicial. But, I was always one to say, well, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. You're not going to be able. I didn't spend a lot of time agonizing about one or the other. I just wanted to see whatever was going to be done, that it was done right.
To my recollection, you always seemed like one of those legislators who, there would be pitched battles on one side or the other. And you were always one of those legislators who was kind of in the middle of conversations, taking it all in. And then one of those legislators that whichever side was going to prevail needed to have on their side to win. Kind of a predictor in that way. Does that seem accurate to you?
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Okay. And what was Southwest Kansas, the district you represented, like then? There's been so much change in that part of the state in terms of migration in and the labor force and
Yeah.
majority Latino communities now. What was it like then? Was it in the midst of that change then?
Yes, it was changing then. Far greater population increase. I attribute that to, if you want to point to one thing, it was the building of a meat processing company, National Beef, I think it was called.
Right.
A lot of people moved in from outside of Kansas. A lot of Hispanic population expanded then. And so it you know, represented a reason, I guess, for a change in thinking, and many of the people that now lived in liberal Kansas that didn't live there before.
Right. And that had to affect local politics in some way. I mean, it was such a dramatic change.
Yes, it probably did, although it'd be hard for me to diagram how it happened.
Right.
But I do know there were other opinions and different ways of thinking about things that came, so we had more to think about and other opinions to consider. But generally speaking, it was not an unhappy time. It was good.
As an attorney and as somebody who was very much involved in legal issues during your time in the legislature, in recent years, the judiciary has come under attack to some degree, both at the federal and state levels, with people complaining about quote-unquote unelected judges imposing their judgment over that of the legislature in terms of school funding and a host of other issues. Now, you've watched that as a citizen and not as a legislator, but do you have any views on that trend and that rhetoric?
Well, my opinion is that judges have to make decisions when there are issues that arise out of a law. If there are two different sides, two different ways of looking at things. And it ultimately, the way our system is you take it to the courts. And so we lay it at the feet of the judge. And if the people don't like the decision, of course, they're going to complain about the judge, but they had to have a decision. Somebody had to make a decision, and we don't have a system of government where we put it up for a public vote. That would be, I would say, be virtually impossible. You have to centralize the decision-making somewhere, and then where else but in the judiciary, where people who have studied the law understand how the law works. They may have different opinions about what the law should be, but it just made sense to me that those decisions had to be made in the courts.
And there's a reason, again, the phrase unelected judges, there's a reason why judges, particularly at the appellate court level, we should mention that the Kansas Court of Appeals was created while you were serving in the legislature.
Yeah.
But judges at the appellate level, there's a reason, isn't there, for insulating them from politics?
Insulating judges from politics?
Yeah, from electoral politics.
Well, I think so. Some people would say, well, you know, if the judges have to decide how laws should be interpreted, I'd rather have a conservative Republican than a liberal Democrat. You know, they might politicize it in that respect.
Right, sure.
And I would rather that not be the decision as who would be the judge. I'd rather have it be more of a decision based upon the understanding or the philosophy of the judge or something of that nature.
And, you know, the best judges are people, everybody has their political opinions and their political views, but a judge is pretty much required, you can never fully set those aside, but just to look at the law and interpret it and to apply the law as the legislative branch intended. And there's oftentimes a lot of gray area. There's room for interpretation, right?
That's correct, yeah. And the judges that I knew where I practiced in Seward County and in that area were pretty good judges, in my opinion. It was an older man, Judge Morgan. And so I never had any real quarrel with the judges.
They were impartial and fair as far as you could
As far as I could tell, yeah.
Earlier in our conversation, you indicated that you thought the partisanship was, even when you were here, was somewhat sharper in the House than in the Senate. And I never gave you an opportunity to talk about what it was like in the Senate that was different than what it was like in the House.
Well, the partisanship is similar, of course. The Democrats were on one side and the Republicans on the other.
Right.
But I don't think it was quite as partisan. I think in the Senate.
Fewer members, more collegial body, people knew one another better maybe? Or?
Yeah, well, we all knew each other pretty well. By the time you've been there for a few years, you would know each other pretty well. But I never saw it as being a real hardline issue, a political issue.
I remember when I was covering the legislature in the mid-'80s, this urban-rural split manifested itself into a little bit more of a partisan twist. There was a group, particularly in the House, who became known as the Cowboys. Do you remember that?
I do remember the Cowboys, yeah. I was the majority leader in the House when the Cowboys were rising.
Yeah. Yeah, and that must have made your job as the majority leader more difficult.
Oh yeah, they would come into my office and they want to see me and talk about things. Not as an opponent, but just because I happened to be in leadership.
Right.
And so I welcomed that opportunity. And the Cowboys had, I don't know if I could say a more conservative view.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, a more conservative view.
Yeah.
Kind of a combination of a more conservative rural view on things, thinking that maybe rural areas weren't adequately represented. And so I guess my judgment was they started to surface and become a little bit more aggressive in terms. They became an actual faction within the legislature, and you had to deal with them as majority leader and make sure you understood where they were going to be on a particular bill and that kind of thing. Yeah,
that's true, you did. And they didn't always come to me for advice, that's for sure, because I don't think I would ever consider myself a cowboy, but although I was from a cowboy country, But that's the way it was then.
Yeah, they probably came to your office and said, if you need our support for this bill, this is what you need to do for us.
Yeah.
You had conversations like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was not unusual.
And David Miller, I think, was, again, not anybody I would necessarily consider a cowboy. He was an insurance salesman from Eudora, but he was kind of the leader of that contingent. And J.C. Long and I think Jerry Friedman from Great Bend and some others. Do you remember those guys?
I do. J.C. Long and Jerry Friedman, Dave Miller,
Yeah.
They were all I liked them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were all very good guys.
Bright guys.
Uh-huh.
But nevertheless, your job as majority leader was to get stuff done.
Yeah, we had to get legislation passed, and that required them to be able to vote for what we thought should be. When I say we, I'm talking about mostly Wendell Lady was the speaker at that time, and so definitely.
And I can't remember the exact numbers, but the breakdown between Republicans and the Democrats was a little closer in those days. In fact, of all the years you served in the legislature, you served a few in the minority when Democrats took over under John Carlin as the Speaker of the House, later Governor, and then later again under Marvin Barkas, I think in the early 90s, right? So you had the experience of being in the majority for most of your time, but also in the minority.
Yeah. That's right, I was. I was, if I remember correctly, when Marvin came in as a leader, I was out, I believe.
Maybe on your way to the Senate by that point?
Yeah.
Well, I think you were out entirely, that's right. You would have been out by then.
Yeah.
But earlier on, when John Carlin was the Speaker of the House, you were here then.
Yes, I was.
And so, when you look back on your time in the legislature, you stayed for long enough, one would think that you enjoyed that service. Did you enjoy being here?
Definitely, yeah.
What did you like about it?
Well, I had chosen to go to law school, so I had an interest in the law. And where else would you want to go but where the laws are made, It was just an environment that I liked. I liked the collegiality of the legislature and the issues and the way that they were resolved. Seemed like it makes sense to me that the legislative process is a good way to resolve issues of that sort, what the law should be. And that includes the judiciary.
Right.
So it just all fit in right. I felt comfortable.
Yeah. And your peers must have obviously thought a lot of you to elect you the majority leader. Do you recall how that came about? What prompted you to run for leadership? And
You know, my memory is not as good as it used to be.
yeah,
But I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why. People had their reasons. I never really questioned them,
right.
but they did, you know,
In those
listen
days,
to what I had to say.
In those days, Wendell Lady was the speaker. He was from
Johnson County.
Johnson County.
Yeah.
In those days, there was an intentional, and maybe still there is, an intentional effort to balance the leadership. So you made sure to have some rural and somebody from somewhere other than one of the big metro areas.
I agree, yeah. It would have been concerning to people from western Kansas if they didn't have some leadership in the legislature who they could go and talk to, that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, that's why the Cowboys were in your office from time to time, is they,
Right.
as you said, you represented the Cowboy area, even though you didn't consider yourself.
Yeah, the Cowboys weren't necessarily divided by eastern and western
That's right.
Kansas,
That's
but it was important, though, that western Kansans felt like they were being represented because of those wide open spaces. You know, my district was huge compared to Wendell Lady's district in Johnson County.
Right, even when you were in the House.
Oh, yeah.
When you went to the Senate, it got even bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that leads me to another set of questions, because there are challenges to representing a district that big and
Yeah.
that far away from Topeka. You had to, when I asked you if you liked serving here, you had to like it, because I mean, how many hundreds of miles would you drive week in and week out just to serve here?
A lot of miles. I used to tell people up here on a Friday afternoon, you know, that I'm going home, and you know, for me to drive east as far as I have to drive west just to get home, I'd be over in Indiana.
Yeah,
You know, just to kind of get an idea, you know, of what you're doing.
yeah.
Because you don't always know that. You don't have a concept in your mind about how far away it is. And I tried to impress the people, it's a long way from here. And it was. I ended up learning how to fly an airplane because the travel was so long.
Oh, really? I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, so I ended up flying back and forth. I flew my own airplane. And that's not uncommon in western Kansas anyway, to do that, because the distances were so great.
And even when you were home, let's say you went home for a weekend and you were going to meet with
yeah.
constituents, one end of the district for the other, I mean, hundreds of miles even doing that.
Yeah, it was to go, it was like close to 100 miles from my home to go to a constituent meeting in another part of the district.
Did that make serving more difficult? I mean, when you have an area that big, it seems like there might be more diversity of opinion, and if you were in one part of the district versus another, there might be, people might think very differently on some of these big issues.
It's true. There were differences of opinion, but Dodge City, when I was in the Senate, Dodge City was part of my district.
Oh, it was, okay.
And Dodge City was not like liberal Kansas.
Right.
It was different. It was different. And so you had to understand that, and you know, you had to factor that in when you were talking with people and making decisions.
And so when you lost that election when you ran for re-election to the Senate, how many years later was it? I mean, well, it had been several years later that Bill Graves then asked you to serve on the State Board of Tax Appeals, correct?
Yeah. I was living in Wichita then.
At the time?
And I don't know what his thinking was, but I liked the idea. So
His thinking was you had been chairman of the Judiciary Committee and had been one of those kind of even-handed legislators. I mean, that's what you need in a quasi-judicial administrative body like the Board of Tax Appeals, because again, that body has been off and on fairly controversial too, because they have to make a lot of judgment calls.
Yes, you do.
Did you enjoy your time on the board?
On the board, I did, yes.
Were you there when Gus McLean was there as well, or at all?
Yes.
Were you?
And we decided, you know, the issue was the value of property. If you want to quantify it, it was just, that's what it was all about. And it involved taxation, of course.
Right.
Not what the taxes would be, but how that value affected your taxation. So it was something that people had strong opinions about.
Of course they did. It affected their pocketbook directly. And
Yeah.
while during your time in the legislature, there were several issues. You reappraised property all across the state, and so people saw their taxes, some people saw their taxes change pretty dramatically. You had debate after debate over how to value agriculture property over your time.
Yeah.
You remember those conversations? I mean, those constituents probably were as attentive to those conversations as anything.
Oh yeah, yeah, they were. And I don't have memories of being very uncomfortable about it. I mean, it was an issue.
Right.
It was, you know, there obviously were divided opinions about the way things should be, but that's what it's all about. You know, I didn't stress a lot about that. And
the severance tax in the mid-'80s, when that was passed, Governor John Carlin wanted that severance tax. That's an oil and gas producing area that you represented at the time.
Yes.
And so, was that a big issue in your district?
It was, but I have no recollection of it being an agonizing issue.
Right. You recall? Were you an opponent or a supporter of that? Do you recall?
I'm pretty sure I was a supporter.
Really, in that neck of the woods, that might have been semi-courageous.
Well, possibly, but you know, it made sense.
And also, there's been an awful lot of debate over the years that I've watched the Kansas legislature in operation over how to fund schools. And we finally look like we're starting to resolve that, but there have been so many different attempts. I mean, in a big picture sense, do you recall anything about those conversations? And
well, school funding was, I never really got into that issue a great deal.
But it had to do with property valuation in the sense that some districts that the property didn't appraise at a very high value, some southeast Kansas districts versus some districts where there was a lot of oil and gas wealth where the appraisals were relatively high. The property tax, a mill levy in one place would raise a lot of money, and in another place not so much.
Yeah.
So the effort was to try to equalize educational opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's been a hard needle to thread.
Yes, it has, but it made sense to me that, you know, why should kids in a poor area have to get a poorer education if you qualify the education based upon the money that's spent? And so, you know, if it made sense to me, I mean, apparently it did at that time, that you do have to set up a school funding situation where you might have to prop up some areas in order to get the funding for the schools that didn't have the tax base to support it. It made sense to me. And so I did not lose a lot of sleep about school funding in the sense that I think the ultimate goal was a worthy goal.
Yeah. Well, Bob, is there anything I didn't ask you about that you want to talk about?
Oh, things that I wanted to talk about. Well, just the people.
Okay.
When we were in the legislature, I can remember a lot of, you know, good friendships. Didn't matter party. When we were in Topeka here, we got along pretty well. I don't remember any very unsavory situations at all. And I've kept up with a lot of my colleagues, some of whom are now passed.
Right. It did seem, when I got here in the early 80s, and it seemed like a very collegial place. I have often referred to it as kind of its own small town. You know, you had all different kinds of people, you know, on the 5 floors of the State House, and just like a small community would, and the place accommodated them all.
Yes, it's true. As far as I could see here, people got along in their private lives pretty well with each other. May have great differences in the political side, but you know, in the private life, we didn't cross.
So in other words, that's the proverbial story of the 2 legislators of opposite parties. You get up on the floor and can argue.
Yeah.
And then as soon as the day is done, they go out for a drink together.
Yeah,
That's
right. That's the way it would be. It had to be that way. It would be very unhappy if it were another way, I think.
Well, there have been years in recent history that it wasn't that way.
Yeah. That isn't the kind of experience that I remember having.
Yeah. Do you remember what your favorite gathering spot when you were here during your time? Is there a particular place that stands out where you'd all get together in the evening after the day's business?
Well, they were right closely around the Capitol building here. They were almost always a restaurant, bar.
And there were hospitality rooms hosted by various lobbying organizations, maybe particularly early on when you got here, right?
Yes, but yes, there were, but that was not a place that I would hang out at.
Okay.
Well, I wouldn't hang out at a bar either, for that matter. But you know, I had my own life to live.
And you go out to dinner though with friends.
Oh yeah, we would go out to dinner. Lobbyists were very important in our lives. For communications purposes, we had to get information and give information, and that was a good way to do it.
Anybody stand out in your mind as being Mary Turkington, who represented the truckers? Was here at the time?
Yeah, Mary, I remember very well. Mary was a very professional woman. I mean, she was
a trailblazer in a lot of ways.
Yeah, incredible. I remember her well. She was intimidating.
In a very nice way.
Yeah.
If she winked at you, you knew you were in trouble.
That's right.
Or if she used your full name, you knew you were in trouble. It was pretty subtle, but you could tell.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Anybody else? I mean, Pete McGill, who had been speaker, went over to found one of the biggest lobbying firms.
Yeah, and since I've been gone, I've kind of lost track of his organization. But yeah, Pat Hubbard, the beer wholesalers of all people, you know. Pat was a big guy, and he had a big voice, and you know, he was fun to be around.
I've often joked, because I know Pat Hubbard, I've often joked, when you look up the term lobbyist in the dictionary, it should be his picture there, because he just fits all. He's kind of one of those hail fellow, well met, big voice, well dressed, you know, slaps you on the back.
Exactly.
Kind of guy nobody would mind spending time with.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's the way it was. But there were a lot of other people who were not that way, who I liked as well. I mean, it was a good community that we were in here.
Community, that's a good word for it.
We get to know each other, and we don't necessarily mingle in terms of family-like things, but socially, it was a good experience.
Well, I'm glad you came back to the Capitol to talk to us today. I really thank you for your time.
Well, it's fun to be here, my wife and I. My wife, who was, we met in Liberal, Kansas. Her father had come there from, originally from Nicaragua.
Oh.
And we've been married a long time now, and we still have our contacts out there in western Kansas. So it was a good experience.
Yeah.
And we're still living the life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking to us today, and again, thank you for your service to this state.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure.